Yeah.
Renowned Fortean TV appearer, and a few other things, is going to talk about Keel and the Mothman, the making of the movie, events in Point Pleasant, and the evolving image of Mothman itself. Please welcome back to the lectern here at FortFests 2002, Doug Skinner.
Thank you, Larry. Well, first of all, I would like to say that this was not my idea. I didn't contact Phyllis and say, well, I'm a friend and fan of John Keel, so please let me come talk about him before a hostile and discerning audience. No, actually it was Bob Ricard's fault. Bob Ricard, as some of you may know, is the editor of the Fortean Times, and he invited me to give a talk on Keel and the Mothman earlier this year in London. And it made sense. The Mothman Prophecies has, of course, now been made into a movie. The book is back in print. Mothman and all of the creepy doings in Point Pleasant are now debated in magazines and over the internet. I recently typed Mothman into a search engine and got 492,000 hits. So it's only fitting that John Keel and the Mothman be represented here as well. Originally, as you know, Keel was supposed to come. He is busy in New York, and he also has a very bad case of the flu. Besides, he said he was planning to throw a big party as soon as I left town. So I'm not here to speak for him or to defend his strange ideas. I'd like you to think of this as a tribute to him and a celebration of the renewed interest in Mothman. I'll be talking about his life. I hope some things that you haven't known about, and also about Point Pleasant, and try to give a bit of perspective on both of those that may help make things make more sense. And so, in my first slide here,
That one?
That one, yes. You see me standing in the jaws of the monster, ready to talk about Keel, and may the ultra-terrestrials have mercy on my soul. But when I first told Keel that I'd been invited to talk about John Keel and the Mothman, I was sure that he would think that it was a terrible idea. Instead, he said, so talk about John Keel and the Mothman. Use the frog puppet. Well, I thought this was a terrible idea, but nevertheless, here at Keel's request is the frog puppet.
Hi!
Well, welcome to Washington.
Oh, thanks. Hey, what happened to the sky?
Well, we're in a building now.
A what?
This is a building. It's like your box, only bigger.
Oh, okay. I thought it was the end of the world or something.
No, not yet.
Well, that's good. Where are the air holes?
Well, you can't put air holes in a building.
No?
No, that would let the rain in.
What's wrong with that?
Well,
One of the greatest joys in life is sitting in a raging thunderstorm, singing at the top of your lungs and gorging yourself on insects.
well, I never tried it.
Now you ought to get out more.
Well, do you have any thoughts on Mothman before I put you away?
Sounds delicious.
Put you back in the box then.
All right, good luck on your show or whatever it is.
All right. Well, now that I've introduced the talking frog, I've come to a crossroads. I can segue to Fort, who did say, we shall pick up an existence by its frogs, or I can pick up an existence by its ventriloquism. Next slide. I first met John Keel in my capacity as a ventriloquist. He came to a comedy club where I was hypnotizing my dummy to relive a UFO abduction. He invited me to come perform at the FortFest, and later, in a touching ceremony, he gave me his childhood ventriloquism manual. Next page. There's his name written in his little childhood printing press. And what was Keel's childhood like? Well, he was born in Cornell, New York, up near the Canadian border, March 25th, 1930. His father was a musician, and he described his mother as a lively, pretty girl. But the marriage didn't last. They soon divorced, and so young John went to live with his grandparents. Around this time, he was an avid magic buff, and he spent hours practicing his coin and card tricks and making irritating squeaking noises on his ventrilo from the Johnson Smith catalog. He was fascinated by Houdini and read all he could find about him. Continued to be interested in Houdini. This is an article he wrote many years later. He still loves magic and often visits the remaining magic store in New York. His parents remarried when he was 10, so he went to live with his mother and her new husband on a farm in Perry, New York. He continued to read, not just about magic, but science, navigation, humor, anything he could get his hands on. And he started writing. By the time he was 14, he was renting out his own office above the barber shop and sending out submissions to magazines. Next. He was also reading Fort, of course, seen here in a lovely Skinner portrait for the Info Journal. But for the record, he does say that Jean-Paul Sartre was a much greater influence on him. So read your Sartre, everybody. Next. Like many teens of the time, he was also a big science fiction buff and published his own fanzine. It was called The Lunarite. It was a lot classier than many of the other fanzines around because he was able to typeset it. He was able to do this because he was writing a column for the local paper at the time. It was called Scraping the Keel and appeared in the Perry Herald. I know nothing more about it. Well, the turning point for the aspiring young Keel was a sale to the New Yorker. It was just a short piece about holidays, and he didn't even get a byline. But it was still quite a coup for a teenage writer to sell to the New Yorker. So he put the traditional 75 cents in his pocket and hitchhiked to Manhattan, eager to write full-time. And he doesn't seem to have had much contact with his family after that. They certainly don't seem to have had much interest in his work. He said he would give them recordings of his radio appearances, and they would give them to local children to play flying saucer with. And at one point, his mother did proudly announce that she had a copy of one of his books and produced a tattered paperback by Donald Kehoe. Next. So he left for Greenwich Village, where he met such village characters as Maxwell Bodenheim. This is one of his books from my prized Bodenheim collection. And Joe Gould. Keel edited a poetry magazine. He finished a couple of novels. One called West of Washington Square was thrown out by an irate landlord. He contributed to magazines and wrote for radio and TV. TV, of course, then was still in its infancy. He was working with a cartoonist on a proposed comic strip about television when the Korean War intervened. Keel was drafted and ended up in Germany, where he was put to work on the Armed Forces radio. Some of his programs, like remote broadcasts from Frankenstein's Castle and the Great Pyramid, were a big hit, and so after his service was ended, he was offered a few jobs in the radio industry. But, next, all that childhood reading had done its mischief, and Keel was eager for adventure. So he cleared out his bank account and headed for Cairo. And for the next few years, he wandered through the East, learning how to charm snakes, visiting mummy makers, and all that sort of thing, supporting himself by turning his adventures into articles for men's adventure magazines. Here he's seen with the famous Mount Everest Sherpa Tenzing Norgay. One of his scoops was learning the secret of the Indian rope trick. It was, as it turned out, not a very good trick, and his attempt to perform it was somewhat of a flop, but it did make a good article. The Indian who taught him the trick told him, "Teach yourself to be curious, not skeptical. You will learn more because you will see more." So Keel responded by printing up cards that read, "John A. Keel, not an authority on anything," and found that they opened doors everywhere. Well, the precarious livelihood soon came to an end in Singapore, where the authorities deported him because he had no means of support. So he settled down in Barcelona with his German girlfriend Lita. Said that you could live there for almost next to nothing. And he was particularly attracted to Barcelona because they still had vaudeville. Lita would go to piano concerts and John would go to vaudeville. He tried to sell a book about Mideast politics called Pattern for Adventure, but every publisher told him nobody's interested in Mideast politics. So instead he wrote a book about his travels. Jadoo, which was promoted energetically by the publisher and sold well. Keel moved back to New York, at which point Lita broke up with him because she had traveled all around the world with him and said she could not live in New York. But he did his best to promote the book by touring the lecture circuit with a boa constrictor and giving regular snake charming performances in a Times Square pet shop window, which lasted until the neighbors in his apartment house learned that he was keeping cobras in his apartment. But his profile at the time might be summed up by this blurb from the well-known literary journal Men's Digest, which printed some of his stories. John A. Keel cannot write unless he is climbing mountains, cutting through jungles, or meeting exciting females. At 28, he has known many more countries, more sights, more women than an ordinary man would know in a millennium. And the stories he then tells are insistent, demanding, as his life constantly is. It is the raw, elemental life of a Hemingway, but told with the rich style of a Homer. Here then is a story for men by a man worthy of the name. Well, even the manliest of men cannot live on daring do alone, so Keel kept writing magazine pieces on photography and electronics. He had a syndicated column for a while. And he was also writing for TV. He provided ad-libs for Merv Griffin and managed to turn out 200 episodes of a slapstick TV show called Mac and Meyer for Hire, starring Joey Fay and Mickey Deans, two ex-burlesque comics. He said there was a prop budget of $75 per episode and that the show was written around that. Thanks to one of my New York colleagues, Mark Newgarden, beloved creator of the Garbage Pail Kids, who brought joy into so many American households, we do have a cassette of many episodes of Mac and Meyer for Hire. I don't think we have time to play them here, but they will be around this weekend if there's a VCR in some time. Next. We're coming to a critical juncture here, and I hope that some of this biographical background will help to make sense of it. First, though, I'd like to mention one of Keel's unexpected contributions to film history. He himself was an amateur filmmaker and invited these budding auteurs, George and Mike Kuchar, to show some of their early efforts at the Metropolitan Motion Picture Club in New York. Most of the members there screened family and travel footage, so some of the Kuchar films like Lust for Ecstasy and The Naked and the Nude must have been a refreshing change of pace. One of George's films, in which he explored the comic potential of thalidomide birth defects, caused somewhat of a negative reaction there, though. As George wrote in his memoirs, Mr. Keel was proud that mine was the only film in the history of the Metropolitan Motion Picture Club ever given a bad review. So he was also helping to mold young minds. The bird. But up above those darkened theaters, though, with funny things flitting through the clouds, Keel had some curiosity about UFOs since the beginning, but he didn't pursue the subject seriously until about 1965. That year, Playboy commissioned him to write the definitive study, beginning with a flat in upstate New York near his hometown. UFOs are indeed a fascinating topic. I'm fascinated in them myself, but I realize they seldom seem to bring peace and prosperity to the student. It was the great Irish writer Flann O'Brien who pointed out that saucer is an anagram for a curse. And I'd also like to add that the Italian word, UFO, means free, for nothing, as in the usual fee for UFO research. Turning to the French, we find that soucoupe, saucer, breaks down into sou, a small coin, and coupe, the act of cutting, as in the usual fee for UFO research. Whereas volant, flying, also means stealing. Furthermore, the word for UFO in many Latin languages, ovni, rearranged, yields ovin, which in French means a sheep-like, and vino, as in the usual fee for UFO research. So, judging from this Kabbalistic analysis, there may be rough times ahead for Keel's bank account. He spent the next few years trying to figure out the UFO phenomenon. He didn't, unfortunately. Nobody has, but he did work at it. There was a major flap going on at the time, and he crisscrossed the country, interviewing witnesses, collecting evidence, subscribing to clipping bureaus. It became increasingly evident to him that UFOs could not be separated from other Fortean puzzles, monster sightings, poltergeists, and so on. They all seem to be tied together. 1965 was a very different time, and some of the Point Pleasant flap might make more sense if we did look a bit at it. Kennedy had just been assassinated, and the nation was not only grieved, but baffled. The Warren Commission raised more questions than it answered and provided fertilizer for a bumper crop of conspiracy theories. I think fertilizer is the right word there. Lyndon Johnson was increasingly unpopular for his failure to disentangle the country from Vietnam. So the anti-war movement was starting up, and the government was stepping up its surveillance of the left. One good barometer of the culture at the time was The Realist, a magazine of leftist politics, social commentary, and satire, not always in that order, not always in any order. It was edited by Paul Krasner, and he ran articles by Lenny Bruce, Robert Anton Wilson, Madeleine Murray O'Hare. The subjects included civil rights, conspiracy rumors, and sexual freedom. And I didn't pick the Realist at random, because I bought this stack at a library sale in New York a couple of years ago, and it wasn't until I got home that they noticed that they were John Keel's subscription copies. I called him up and he ridiculed me for buying his garbage. And even worse, I must report that he had cut out many of the cartoons. Kitsch and camp were the bywords that year, and pop culture nostalgia was very big. Superheroes and parodies of them were particularly somewhat of a fad. Tongue-in-cheek version of Batman was doing well on TV. Here we have Mad presenting a takeoff of the put-on, which was very much in the spirit of the times. Even Jerry Siegel, the creator of Superman, got into the act. Keel, by the way, did once write for Jerry Siegel's line of comic books, but had no part in this particular contribution. He did, however, make his own contribution to the genre with The Fickle Finger of Fate, illustrated by Mads Al Jaffe. This is all about Satyr Man, a virile superhero in a jet-age plastic helmet who baffles the evil Mr. Big amid a cavalcade of sex scenes and sound effects. So later in that year, which is 1966, Keel was in West Virginia investigating Thomas, a winged cat. Thomas was interesting, but reports of an even more intriguing winged creature started coming in from Point Pleasant on the Ohio border. Well, the first major sighting was November 15th, 1966. Two young couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, Steve and Mary Mallette, were out driving, and they passed through the TNT area. It's a complex of underground tunnels and concrete igloos built on World War II to manufacture and store explosives. By 1966, it was frequented mostly by necking teenagers. But that evening, they saw something else, a 6 to 7 foot tall creature with thick legs, long wings, and huge red eyes shuffling through the igloos. They rapidly drove in the general direction of away, and it flew after them, keeping up with the car even when they were driving 100 miles an hour. And Mary Millette said that it squeaked like a big mouse. They notified the sheriff, who knew all of them and had no reason to disbelieve their stories on general principle. They went back to the TNT area and did not find the creature, but the sheriff's radar went haywire, and they noticed that a dead dog that had been there earlier was now gone. Well, this sketch was based on one by Roger Scarberry, but I always see it as based on a sketch by Roger Scarberry. And nobody seems to know what happened to the original sketch. So at any rate, you should regard this with the utmost suspicion. It is a sketch of a sketch. The sighting was reported in the newspaper, which prompted some earlier reports from November 1st and November 12th. At first, the creature was just called the Bird. This is an early mention in Fate magazine. But soon newspaper reporters started calling it Mothman. I suppose if ventriloquism had been as popular then as high camp superheroes, the squeaking monstrosity might have been called the Ventrilo Bird. But he did become Mothman, although he was neither a moth and a man, and joined such inappropriate expressions as English horn, alligator pear, and democratic election. This, by the way, is a later article from Fate. Keel collected over 100 sightings over the next year. The next one was the following night. Many of these sightings were disturbingly similar, and many were bafflingly divergent. Several were more like Bigfoot reports. And one witness, Connie Carpenter, suffered the red swollen eyes that are usually seen in UFO cases. Well, all of this was completely appalling. You had witnesses with names who were known to the authorities, multiple sightings, physical symptoms, red eyes and damaged skin, radio interference, and front and center you had this ridiculous bug-eyed monster that sounded like the Thunderbird of Native American legend or the Garuda of Hindu mythology, which is depicted here. It couldn't be dismissed as just an urban legend, but it was also clearly impossible. Well, as is traditional, experts were summoned to explain it all away. Biologists identified it either as a sandhill crane or an owl. Witnesses were shown pictures of these nice explanatory birds, but said it didn't look like the Mothman. Nevertheless, experts are, by definition, more expert than witnesses, so most people considered the case closed. Two rare birds were caught in the area, an Arctic snow owl and a turkey vulture. Both were a bit small to fit the bill, but were pressed into service anyway. Keel thought that some sightings probably had been an owl, and in fact was startled by a large owl one night, and thought some reports also might have been bears. But he could not find the physical evidence, like tracks or droppings, that would indicate that there was a physical being of that size. And of course, in Point Pleasant, people were being plagued by things other than Mothman. There was a steady stream of aerial lights, animal mutilations, pet disappearances, poltergeists, saucer sightings, telephone and television interference. And there were funny people afoot, strange men in black suits who made vague threats and didn't seem to know what forks and spoons were. One young couple in Ravenswood was hit by a blue light one night in their car. The next day they were painfully sunburned from head to foot, and the boy's eyes were swollen for 2 weeks. Keel said he was struck by the fact that the boy was less scared of whatever had caused this than he was of the girl's father. He kept saying, "What am I going to tell her dad?" Contactee cases were also common there. One woman claimed to receive messages from a certain Mr. Apple, and then there was Woodrow Derenberger. Derenberger was driving home to Mineral Wells, West Virginia, on the evening of November 7th, 1966, and ran into a large UFO blocking the road with a grinning man in a checked suit who came out and chatted with Derenberger without moving his lips. I think his real name was probably Mr. Ventrilo, but he said that he was Indrid Cold from the planet Lanulos. There was also an absurd amount of UFO activity that year. Keel was in touch with many contactees. Some were obvious hoaxers, others seemed more sincere and passed on personal information and semi-accurate prophecies that he didn't quite know what to do with. Nor was Keel immune to all of this activity. He found that the more that he pursued the paranormal, the more it pursued him. He had endless bizarre problems with his phone and mail. I should point out that it's not impossible that Keel was in fact being harassed by the government, not because of anything about Mothman, but because of the Cold War in Vietnam. And U.S. intelligence might have had their own reasons for being suspicious of a freelance journalist who read The Realist, took mysterious long trips in rented cars, and hung around the military installations at night, shining flashlights up into the sky. But a flap like this attracted a lot of attention from people other than Keel. Reporters and UFO researchers flocked to the area. And after 13 months of this high-octane strangeness, the Silver Bridge in Point Pleasant collapsed. A traffic light was stuck on, cars were backed up, and the bridge gave way, killing 46 people. This may seem to have nothing to do with Mothman, but it did to Keel since his contactee network had predicted a disastrous power blackout for that day. He suspected that the collapse was sabotage, especially since 2 men had been seen climbing on it 2 days before. He collected an enormous amount of material from this year of strangeness and set to work trying to wrestle it into a book. At first, he devoted a chapter to it in his 1970 book, Strange Creatures from Time and Space. Gray Barker is one of the other UFO writers in the area, and he turned the story into a novel that year. I should add that the presence of Gray Barker in the area may raise certain questions, which I hope I can return to later. Meanwhile, Keel continued to cover the UFO beat, wrote dozens of magazine articles, mostly for men's adventure titles like Argosy, Mail, and Saga. And the UFO research that Playboy had initiated finally resulted in UFO's Operation Trojan Horse in 1970. Apparently all of his years of investigation had left him completely stumped. The book doesn't dismiss UFOs, but it does argue that they're more like traditional ghosts or demons than spacecraft. The next year, Our Haunted Planet developed this idea that there were ultra-terrestrials. This, as Keel pointed out, was not a term that he coined, but that there were entities on Earth that were neither extraterrestrials nor terrestrials. He tied it into the illumination experience and a massive collective overall of our planet. Well, at this point, Keel was ready for a change. He got a government job. I know this will make many conspiracy theorists perk up their ears, but he was working for HEW, advising on cost management in their publications department. The Mothman Prophecies came out in 1975. The working title was The Year of the Garuda, but apparently the American superhero influence was stronger than the Hindu deity. This is how Mothman appeared on the original cover. One curious note is that the original edition of the book sold only 50 copies in West Virginia. About half of his manuscript was cut by what Keel described as faceless little men in the publishing business, and he reworked some of it into the book The Eighth Tower, which is, in his own words, primarily an attempt to simplify quantum physics and demonstrate how our perception of reality is manipulated by various natural energies. Here we have another development in the graphic evolution of Mothman. Keel wrote a number of articles for High Times in the 1980s, including a long interview and this summary of the events in Point Pleasant. Frank Frazetta painted this cover, which is certainly prettier than some of the earlier images we've seen. And it was also used for the Illuminate reissue in 1991. My favorite portrait of Mothman, though, still is the one that Keel put on his own business card. Hollywood showed an interest in Mothman from the beginning, but that contract never seemed to materialize. Instead, scriptwriters happily helped themselves to the ideas in his books. The TV show The Invaders, which was about a reporter trying to warn the world about hostile aliens, was reportedly based on Keel. And The X-Files has used his work sort of as an ATM, making frequent withdrawals and no deposits. By this time, Keel did have another book out, Disneyland of the Gods, which drew largely upon his column in Saga magazine. This cover proved to be somewhat of a problem, since many bookstores in the U.S. won't carry anything with a devil on the cover. He made a brave attempt to rescue American culture by reviving the New York Fortean Society, which had lain dormant since the death of the founder, Tiffany Thayer. This rare document shows my original membership card, which bears the number 666, which means that I too cannot be sold in bookstores. And in the 90s, Keel further annoyed people in the UFO community by suggesting that the Roswell saucer crash was due to a Japanese balloon bomb, or Fugo balloon. And one can notice a further disaffection with the UFO community in this pamphlet from the New York Fortean Society, in which Keel calls ufology a sad little hobby for a tiny group of severely maladjusted people. A little bad blood there, I think. I was responsible for the cover of this, if responsible is the right word. Finally, a Mothman movie did seem to be nearing production. There were a few bumps in the road, however. First came the rumors that Keel would not get any money for it, since the story was true, and therefore in the public domain. There was also talk of changing the title, and there were a couple of other smaller, low-budget Mothman movies that were also being shown at film festivals. One of the odder developments during this period was the rumor that Keel had died. This was finally traced to Whitley Strieber, who was sure that he had read the obituary in the newspaper and announced it on his radio show. He did realize it was an error and apologized to Keel and invited him onto his show. But despite all this confusion, the movie finally did make it to the screen. This is the press kit. I'm sure you've seen the poster. As is customary, it does differ from the book in many respects, which is only natural. Among other things, the men in black are removed, since they are now another movie. All UFOs have been taken out, along with all poltergeists, ghost lights, animal mutilations, and other distracting disturbances. Also, Keel did point out that members of the West Virginia police force are not as attractive as depicted in the movie. But that does leave us with Mothman. The hulking, squeaking ventrilo bird is conflated with Mr. Apple, Indrid Cold, and all the other ultra-terrestrials to become a kind of winged gentleman who flies around the world prophesying disasters over the telephone, which makes sense for movie purposes, but has caused some confusion. Judging from some of the articles I've seen on the internet, people seem to think that John Keel is asking us to believe in a winged alien who is an angel of death, which is not really what he was writing about. The film did receive some mixed reviews. Entertainment Weekly was peeved that there was a lack of sex scenes. The New York Times review is devoted to the critics' hatred of Richard Gere. And the New York Daily News was hostile to the whole idea, calling it a long-debunked urban legend. And almost all reviews compared it to the X-Files, which is sad but inevitable. But many critics did like it, and it sold tickets. Furthermore, the book was reissued, and even this was fraught with peril. Some early copies went out with a disclaimer that the book was fiction. This was just what was always done at this particular science fiction publishing house. I guess it's a curse of the Mothman. French and Italian editions have also come out. I brought these here. The French edition is particularly nice. It has a 20-page introduction, 40 pages of notes, pertaining mostly to what was happening in the UFO field in the 1960s. There's a lovely hardback Italian edition as well, Voci dell'Ombra. And there's a nice German edition which has a lot of color pictures from the movie. So the editions have been pouring in, and the book is back in print, which is all for the good. Mothman has even been made into a toy. I haven't seen it in the shop, so I don't know if Barbie's wardrobe will fit him. I certainly hope so. And of course, other Mothman books have been published. There's one by Lauren Coleman, and another compiled from Linda Scarberry's clippings. And along with this has come a new crop of explanations. One story was that Mothman was a balloon that children had painted with a happy face. And one gentleman did claim that the sightings were due to his astral projection over Point Pleasant back in 1966. Joe Nickel of the Skeptical Inquirer said he had the answer. It was a barn owl. As he put it, we are thus faced with a choice between a plausible naturalistic explanation on the one hand and a fanciful, incredible one on the other, which of course doesn't leave much room for debate, does it? Unfortunately, there isn't always a simple explanation for these things. This isn't a mystery mongering, as Nickel calls it, it's just the way that the world works. Allow me to quote Paul Krasner, editor of The Realist, who said, "If life isn't a mystery, then what the fuck is?" Nothing is as tidy as we would like, and we make things so only by pruning away all of the irritants. Keel never claimed to have figured out what was happening in Point Pleasant, and he didn't encourage belief in any explanation. He did suspect that Mothman was more of a diversion than the real story, which is kind of an interesting idea. Some of the physical evidence, like electronic appliances going berserk and eye and skin problems, may indicate some sort of electromagnetic abnormality. But it's hard to say who or why would be responsible for this. In later editions of the book, he was able to add that the explosives stored in the TNT area were nuclear. The igloos held nuclear waste. This, in turn, I suppose, might have provoked some electromagnetic activity, and it certainly might have provoked some government surveillance. He also suspected that there was occult activity in the area, but never found that essential smoking candle. There was also a serial killer on the loose, which of course always contributes to chaos. I'm curious about the fact that Gray Barker was frolicking around in West Virginia at the time. Gray was a very busy hoaxer, and I'd be surprised if he was on his best behavior during all of this weirdness. I must point out that Keel thinks there's nothing to that idea at all. But I think we would agree that it is a mess, and that I hope all of you will be able to figure it out. Keel himself is enjoying the Mothman revival. He thought the movie did a fairly good job in bringing a complicated story to the screen. His neighbors in his apartment house, in a touching tribute, have posted all of the bad reviews from the movie in the lobby. And I hope it brings him happiness. If there's any justice in the world, he will soon be showered with untold riches and assume his rightful place as the monarch of our insane little mudball. It's what he deserves, and frankly, it's what we deserve. Thank you very much.
Did we neglect to mention that Doug is a humorist as well?
And later, in a touching ceremony, he gave me his childhood ventriloquism manual. Next page. There's his name written in his little childhood printing press. And what was Keel's childhood like? Well, he was born in Cornell, New York, up near the Canadian border, March 25th, 1930. His father was a musician, and he described his mother as a lively, pretty girl. But the marriage didn't last. They soon divorced, and so young John went to live with his grandparents. Around this time, he was an avid magic buff, and he spent hours practicing his coin and card tricks and making irritating squeaking noises on his ventrilo from the Johnson Smith catalog. He was fascinated by Houdini and read all he could find about him. Continued to be interested in Houdini. This is an article he wrote many years later. He still loves magic and often visits the
Lithuania. What's wrong with that? Well, one of the greatest joys in life is sitting in a raging thunderstorm, singing at the top of your lungs and gorging yourself on insects. And I've never tried it. Now you ought to get out more. Well, do you have any thoughts on Mothman before I put you away? Sounds delicious.
Put you back in the box then.
All right, good luck on your show or whatever it is.
All right. Well, now that I've introduced the talking frog, I've come to a crossroads. I can segue to Fort, who did say, "We shall pick up an existence by its frogs," or I can pick up an existence by its ventriloquism. Next slide. I first met John Keel in my capacity as a ventriloquist. He came to a comedy club where I was hypnotizing my dummy to relive a UFO abduction. He invited me to come perform at the FortFest. That one, yes, you see me standing in the jaws of the monster, ready to talk about Keel, and may the ultra-terrestrials have mercy on my soul. But when I first told Keel that I'd been invited to talk about John Keel and the Mothman, I was sure that he would think that it was a terrible idea. Instead, he said, "So, talk about John Keel and the Mothman. Use the frog puppet." Well, I thought this was a terrible idea, but nevertheless, here at Keel's request is the frog puppet.
Hey!
Well, welcome to Washington.
Oh, thanks. Hey, what happened to the sky?
Well, we're in a building now.
A what?
This is a building. It's like your box, only bigger.
Oh, okay. I thought it was the end of the world or something.
No, not yet.
Well, that's good. Where are the air holes?
Well, you can't put air holes in a building.
No?
No, that was...
Yeah.
Renowned Fortean TV appearer, and a few other things, is going to talk about Keel and the Mothman, the making of the movie, events in Point Pleasant, and the evolving image of Mothman itself. Please welcome back to the lectern here at FortFest 2002, Doug Skinner.
Thank you, Larry. Well, first of all, I would like to say that this was not my idea. I didn't contact Phyllis and say, "Well, I'm a friend and fan of John Keel, so please let me come talk about him before a hostile and discerning audience." No, actually it was Bob Ricard's fault. Bob Ricard, as some of you may know, is the editor of the Fortean Times, and he invited me to give a talk on Keel and the Mothman earlier this year in London. And it made sense. The Mothman Prophecies has, of course, now been made into a movie. The book is back in print. Mothman and all of the creepy doings in Point Pleasant are now debated in magazines and over the internet. I recently typed Mothman into a search engine and got 492,000 hits. So it's only fitting that John Keel and the Mothman be represented here as well. Originally, as you know, Keel was supposed to come. He is busy in New York, and he also has a very bad case of the flu. Besides, he said he was planning to throw a big party as soon as I left town. So I'm not here to speak for him or to defend his strange ideas. I'd like you to think of this as a tribute to him and a celebration of the renewed interest in Mothman. I'll be talking about his life. I hope some things that you haven't known about. And also about Point Pleasant, and try to give a bit of perspective on both of those that may help make things make more sense. And so, in my first slide here,